Thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone for being here today. As Keith said, my name is Hannah Donoghue. I'm one of our senior analysts here at Retailnet Group, and today I'm going to be talking with you about Retail 2020, specifically in North America. At Retailnet Group, we use a system when we're looking at strategic planning. Instead of taking strictly a historical and taking those trends and bringing them forward, we use a future back approach. And when I say that, I mean that there are certain drivers of change that wouldn't show up in your past numbers, but these drivers will have a significant impact on what the future marketplace will look like. So today, what I'm going to do is walk you through what we think some of those big drivers of change are that will have an impact on the future of retail in North America. And these are drivers that often can be considered within your planning assumptions as you're thinking about strategic planning for the next year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it may be. And so within that, we tend to find that these drivers often come from 5 different places within what we call the framework. So that's societal, technologic, economic, industry, and political. And today I'm going to talk with you about 4 of those, societal, macroeconomic, technologic, and then as Keith mentioned, we're going to have a discussion around the industry. What are the big drivers within the industry that are changing it, and how does that lead us to the winning formats, winning channels, and where is the growth going forward? So with that, I'd like to just start the discussion today around the big macroeconomic drivers of change. These that are often have a very heavy impact and really can change, in particular, consumer liquidity. And so when we talk about the macroeconomic drivers of change, there are a few big buckets that we look at. The first is addressable population growth, which I'll be discussing with you, and that's considering just chain retail. What is the population that you can serve within your stores? We'll look at many of the factors that drive consumer liquidity, obviously impacting trips, spend per trip, and overall consumer behavior. And then we'll talk a little bit about, one other driver would be consumer confidence. And that's just a few to mention. There are obviously many macroeconomic drivers of change that will impact the future, but we feel these are have the biggest impact. So looking first globally, by Retailnet Group's forecast, the world will add about $8 trillion in retail sales. But it's important to note that this growth isn't evenly distributed across the markets. So as you can see on this slide here, we've separated the markets from level 1 to level 5. There are 5 level 5 markets, and those are the markets which we categorize as hyper-developed. And so the US would fall within here along with the UK and a few others. On the other end of the spectrum is the level 1 markets, those that are the least developed, where chain retail still may be less than 10% share of total retail. And what you can see is when you look at the contribution to growth within total retail sales added, you can see that 77% of it is coming from the level 1 to 3 markets, which is indicating that there isn't as much growth coming from these level 4 and 5 developed and hyper-developed markets as competition increases and there's more channel blurring as well. You can see that when next row down, if you look at the addressable population added, so how many new shoppers are available in your market, you can see that 90% of the addressable population growth similarly is coming from these level 1 to 3 markets that still have higher birth rates, as we'll discuss later. And then finally, when we look at the growth in retail as well and the growth in spending, we split that out between what's attributable to social mobility, meaning those that are moving from the traditional trade to chain retail. And then from there, if you were to look at the population from A to E, or the top 10% to the bottom 10%, it's those that are shifting up. And so within level 4 and 5 markets, like the US and like Canada, you can see that only 28% of the growth is coming from that social mobility, while 72% is coming from those same shoppers that we already have spending more. And so when you think from a global picture where the growth is coming, the risk in the level 1 to 3 markets is that if they don't get the social mobility, So if you think about Brazil, Mexico, some of the markets in Latin America where growth has started to slow down, if they don't get that social mobility, we globally the same growth won't occur because so much of it is coming through social mobility. So, as we were discussing social mobility, you can see here, this is just referring to my last point. As a source of consumption growth in these emerging markets, social mobility has actually been slowing. While in the US, over 95% of the population is already addressable. For that reason, it's so important to focus on additional spend per retail. So price and mix become very critical. So, within the macroeconomic drivers, one of the overarching themes that we'll always look at is consumer liquidity. So, looking at employment, wages, credit, savings, really getting down to what is the total available discretionary income that shoppers have. And so, when we start with that, you can see that thinking about these, if consumer liquidity isn't speeding up fast enough or as fast as costs, it starts to create a problem. So when you think about total employment, and I'm sorry, that just skipped through there, total employment within the US is at about 43% of the population. But what's important to note is that within the US, we have 50 distinct economies, and employment varies greatly by state. And so that you can see on the left here, where you have some states like North Dakota with 61% of employment. Now compare that to Mississippi with only 37% of the total population employed. It creates two very distinct economies. And then when you start to compare really across 50 states, you start to see the importance of localism and the importance of looking at things on the state level because the economies of each are so distinct. When we look at the employed as a share of the population, we often refer to the dependency ratio. And that is how many employed people, or excuse me, how many people that are not employed are dependent on those that are. And you can be not employed due to unemployment, but it can also be as a result of age, either too young or already retired. But you can see here that there is a significant distinction, and there are over 29 states that have greater than the U.S. average. But it really varies by state. So just keep in mind as you're thinking about this, as segmentation increases across the U.S. and across Canada, the importance of localism and looking at things on the local level, and even we would argue on the city level, becomes more and more important. And so as you can see here, not only does employment vary by state, but even within states, when you look at total employment, it varies greatly by age. So the under 35 population is increasingly dropping out of the labor force and has a lower share within the labor force as of 2013, while those that are over 55 are working longer. And so they're extending the amount of time that they're employed and remaining at work. And so then as that continues, when you move from employment to income distribution, you can see that similarly as employment varied by state, income distribution also does. So these are just, we picked 5 states, but you can see here, even within these 5, the great income disparity or income distribution disparity between these. If you look at California, for example, on the left, 6% has a household income that's below 10,000, while on the other hand, 7% is above 200,000. Now, if you were to compare that to Mississippi, for example, 12% of the population has an income that's under $10,000 or households. So within that, you can just see, looking only at 2 states, the significant disparity. Again, just reinforcing the need for localism and looking at things on a local level. And you're already starting to see many retailers approach this with different clustering methods, different personalization and segmentation approaches. And so I think when we look out to 2020 in North America, the segmentation will become even more important as a result of many of these macroeconomic drivers. And as I mentioned earlier, even in those states where income is rising, when you take into account housing or transportation costs, you can see that just looking from 2000 to 2010, 44% change or increase in costs. Now, comparing that to household income has only risen 25% in that same respective time period. So in total, there are cases where looking especially in some of the deep urban areas where costs of housing and transportation continue to rise, if income isn't rising as fast, it still creates the same challenges in consumer liquidity that we're seeing today. And so as a result, you're seeing more participation in SNAP, and the government government-sponsored role in consumer liquidity continues to increase. Looking just here, SNAP by the end of 2013 was up to 15% of the total population, while the benefits of SNAP as of November of last year have actually decreased, taking down whether it's a one-person household or a four-person household. There have been decreases in the SNAP benefits, but that's only further compounding some of the consumer liquidity challenges and leading to what we're already seeing is a lot of channel switching and channel blurring as shoppers are really more income constrained. And so you can see here, when you look at the US income distribution, as a result of all of these economic drivers that we've been discussing, there's a declining percent of households that are around in the middle. So if you look right at the middle where that peak is, you can see that if you look at the purple line, which is 1980, and then compare that to the black line, you can see the gap from where we were in the total percentage of the population that used to be in the middle. And actually, if you look to the right, you can see that more people have actually shifted to the right and increased in total income as a percentage. People that have incomes above 100,000 to above 200,000. So you can see again, the idea of marketing down the middle is really not going to work going forward. Segmentation is needed and distinct approaches it will be required going forward. And so when we look in total, as I mentioned when I first started, the addressable population, you can see that within, if you're just looking at these 5 hyper-developed markets, you can see that the addressable population growth is fairly stagnant. The US, fortunately, of these 5 hyper-developed markets, is expected to see the most addressable population growth. And by Retailnet Group forecasts, we'll add 23 million new addressable shoppers by 2020. And when I say addressable, I mean those that we often will call reachable and relevant. So those that have access to the stores, whether they live in an urban area or live in a rural area and can get to the stores, similarly, they're relevant. So they have the consumer liquidity to shop in these chain retail outlets. And when you compare that to many developing markets, you see that the relevant portion, or the portion that's more related to consumer liquidity, tends to have a bigger impact on the total addressable population. So the bottom line here, when we're looking at addressable population, you can see that the US will add 23 million new addressable shoppers. So we are getting some positive net new growth. And you can see that by 2020, the US will have 328 million addressable shoppers. But as chain retail becomes more and more competitive, the competition for those shoppers is heightening, and consumer retention becomes more important than ever. So when we look at addressable population, the way we get to that is first starting at the total population. So you can see one of the benefits of the US and looking at that compared to some of the other hyper-developed markets is that we're still getting some net new growth through net migration. And so we'll get to that total population growth with the help of net migration, which allows us to grow the addressable population. But when we look at addressable, we don't just stop at the total population. We then will often step it down further to the aging population because the distribution of spend at retail does change through age. And so you can see here when you look at the world is fundamentally aging. The US is aging. And so you can see here when you're between 25 to 55, you're at your prime retail spend. Often many life occasions, buying a first home, getting married, having your first child, living independently. Those occasions also often trigger increases in spend. And so when you think about these, the populations that have the greatest share of their population between those age segments tend to have growth within the retail. So you can see here, as these populations age and as the US population ages, the percentage that's over 65 that's reducing their consumption continues to grow. And we'll often refer to that as those shoppers that are aging out of peak consumption years. And so you can see here within the aging population, it really changes the shopping experience. And so all of a sudden, you have retailers that are trying to cater to multiple generations within one store. And within the aging shoppers, you can see when we often look at aging shoppers, we'll often look to Japan as because of their population distribution as one of the best examples of how retailers target that shopper group. And so you can see the changes really across categories in the store, from food to general merchandise to health and beauty, apparel, and also apart from the merchandise, the services and store experience changes as well. You see things like, as simple as slowing the elevators down, changing the carts. We've seen carts in Germany that often will have seats or holders for canes, and you start to see these little shifts that retailers are starting to make to improve the shopping experience. Now that needs to be balanced at the same time as you're still trying to cater to that population that's entering their peak consumption years. So overall, what this just means is an increase in complexity for those retailers that are trying to target multiple generations in one store. It's also important because you can see here, when you look at those shoppers that are aging into peak consumption years versus those that are aging out, so leaving their peak consumption years as they age, you can see that the US ratio of aging in to aging out is only 0.8. And what that means is that we're not actually replacing ourselves. If you are to index the shoppers and look at using when you're in your peak consumption years as one, and then index down your spend as you age or as you're younger and you may be a dependent and not spending as much. When you look at the total population and look at those that are aging into aging out, we're not at one. We're actually not replacing ourselves. And when a lot of the retailers, global retailers, start to think about this, you can see some of the opportunity in the developing and emerging markets where the aging in ratio to aging out is over 4 up to 6 or higher. So you can see that we're really getting a constant shopper base and not really acceleration in growth from this within the US. Now, to put that into dollar value, when you look at, so again, this is what I was referring to from your peak consumption years. So in this chart, we've split out average expenditure. It's a US example, but looking at average expenditure within different age segments. And you can see here that the peak starts to happen between 45 to 54. And this may not necessarily be peak in total spend, but it's peak in retail spend. So you see spend start to shift to services, to travel, to healthcare. And so when you're thinking about retail spend specifically, if you were to apply the 2020 age distribution to 2012, it would represent a loss of $55 billion in retail spend annually, just if you were to apply that age percentage distribution within our market to the present. And so you can see the big impact of an aging society just in dollar value, how that changes. And it also explains why retailers are starting to add more services, trying to capture additional share of that spend that may be leaving the store otherwise. So in total, just to wrap up the macroeconomic discussion, you can see that when you look and step down the actual addressable population, the difference, looking at what we would say is the total population forecast for 2020, compared to then if you age weight the population, and so not all shoppers from a spend point are equal, the addressable goes from 334, excuse me, at the total population to 328 that are addressable, down to 268 million from a age weighted addressable. And so it's a big change in the number of shoppers. And so that's why it's so important when you're looking at your shopper base to really take into account many of these macroeconomic drivers, because it can have a drastic impact on your total population that is addressable to you. So moving on to some of the big societal drivers, these societal drivers are often the slowest moving, but have some of the biggest impacts on the retail industry. So drivers like deferral, where shoppers are putting off key life stages. They're getting married later. They're buying their first home later. They're moving into an apartment on their own later. And so really these key life stages that trigger increases in spending are being pushed off. And so that often means one fewer of every purchase. Other societal drivers that we'll talk about can range from intergenerational distinctions to the impact of ethnic and multicultural, to asset light lifestyles. So these are just a few of the societal drivers that we think will have the highest impact. And I'd like to just take a few minutes to walk you through these currently. So first, just starting with ethnic, when we look at population growth, not only are we getting the population growth from net migration, but that growth is also coming in the births that we're getting. And so you can see that the Hispanic and Asian populations are 68% of the total USA population growth that we'll be getting over this 10-year time span, of which the Hispanic population growth is 53%. And so, what does this mean? When we look at and talk in the industry discussion about the breakout segments, as we often refer to them, one of those segments is ethnic retailers. And these retailers are actually outpacing total retail, and they range really across ethnicities, and they're doing a really good job of targeting these shoppers. And that requires a few things. It requires maintaining the right cultural calendar. It requires having the right home brands. And for many of these retailers, it's importing those home brands and selling them through the store, but having the right relevant assortment, the local assortment for your shopper base. And so you can see as these retailers are very targeted, it impacts the merchandise categories that they carry in the store, but it's also impacting other retailers in the market that are looking to compete with these stores. So that ranges from you're seeing increasingly sophisticated food aisles, but it's not just about food. It's also about celebrations. As I mentioned, being able to maintain and run sort of micro and macro celebrations within your store at one time becomes more and more important. It changes health and beauty, apparel, toys, media within the store and out of the store. So overall, it has a significant impact on the merchandising, whether you're specifically an ethnic retailer or selling through one, or any other retailer as well. It's fundamentally changing the retail experience. Another big driver that we often talk about is urbanization, and also within that, the growth of the ex-urban population. So those areas right outside of the dense urban city centers are also becoming increasingly populated as the distance that shoppers travel from sort of the dense, deep urban area is starting to decrease. And so what that means is it really impacts the store type, the frequency of trip visits, the way you get to the store. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. One of our areas of focus recently has been small stores, and that's been in part due to the growth of these urban populations. Obviously, the real estate constraints are very different there. The economics of the store are very different, but consumers are requiring this. And so, based on the different geographies, you really start to see the impact not only on the trip types, but the basket size, the basket composition. And you can see that the households per store also change as well. So when you're thinking about store locations and the demographics that retailers are serving, you're starting to see different formats as well, from urban clustered stores to rural, and how the stores are assorted differently, how they're merchandised differently, and the marketing as well within these stores. One other driver that we're really looking at today, as I mentioned earlier when I was discussing the aging population, are the intergenerational distinctions. Now more than ever, retailers will have 5 different shopper groups within their store, and each of these shoppers has very different preferences, very different requirements. And so you can see here between these, it all, again, it's just going back to the complexity that retailers need to manage within their store and digitally online as well, to target each of these age segments. Within those specifically, just highlighting quickly the millennial shopper, I think this shopper group is more polarized than ever. I think based on coming out of school, there's a certain group that we'll often call the NEETs, that are either not educated, employed, or in training. And then you have on the other side, and this group in general is more diverse. Deferral often defines this generation, thinking about marriage later, kids later, increased education levels, and they're also urban. I think it's something like about a third of all millennials live in urban areas compared to about 25% of boomers. So you start to see a lot of these drivers of change that are really defining the millennial generation start to take place. Now, from our perspective, where we start to think about that is as these shoppers move into their peak consumption years, how will their preferences be different? What will their requirements be? And how will your store or your offer, your brand offer, need to change in order to better target these shoppers? One other societal driver just to discuss, everyone often talks about health and wellness. And so when we've been looking at health and wellness, I think one of the biggest things that's come out of it for us is, again, just the importance of segmentation. When we looked at differences between a high income store and a low income store, you can start to see that those that are both that shoppers that are both healthy and consciously choose to be active is still a much smaller percentage of the population. And so it's about, 26% of the population accounts for 60% or so of health and wellness spending. And so you can start to see that the importance of localizing to the right demographics in your area and understanding, again, everyone's talking about big data, but understanding the importance of that data and the shoppers in your area becomes more important, because there is still a significant portion of a significant portion of the population that may either be indifferent or inactive. So overall, just to summarize societal and also some of the macro drivers as well, addressable population growth, it allows us to bring new shoppers into into chain retail. If there's employment and wage growth that's on hold, it could freeze social mobility. We talked a lot about the wide economic spectrum and how that relates to, again, the idea of no middle and being very segmented in your offering, very personalized. Smaller households, because often due to deferral, leads to smaller packs and also impacts many channels that traditionally are selling the larger or club size packs. Again, because of factors like urbanization, the role of proximate stores or proximity definitely is impacted as proximity competes with destination stores. So overall, we're just seeing a very different mix coming forward because of many of these macroeconomic and societal drivers as we look out to 2020. So moving into the next area, looking at the technologic drivers of change. When we look at the technologic drivers of change, we don't just look at e-commerce. We often look at 4 different buckets. So we'll look at digital products, digital marketing, digital retail within the store, and then also digital retail out of the store or e-commerce. And so quickly, just touching upon digital products, I think the biggest thing and the most important thing is that they're creating gateways to their stores through these digital products. You might ask, why would these retailers have their own private brand tablet? Well, they're creating closed loop systems where they can promote to their shoppers on those tablets. They can create apps for those tablets, and it's a way to drive loyalty and drive engagement as shoppers are out of the store and in the store as well. So from a digital product standpoint, I think the opportunity for engagement, but also digital marketing continues to rise. And so that's why you're seeing even discounters like Aldi in some markets launching their own private label tablet. Similarly, we're seeing more from a digital marketing standpoint, but also a feedback standpoint. More and more retailers are using listening posts, and these are often at the store level. So they're taking hundreds of feeds ranging from email responses, chat, online feedback, Twitter, all across all social media, and bringing these into a concise scorecard that can be used by first and foremost some of the store managers. So there's an ownership there of how is my store doing, what is the collective feedback from the community within my store. And so these are becoming more and more important to understand the data and make decisions off of that data from these scorecards at the store level. Looking at digital within the store, I think there are many different forms of digital within the store. It can range from assisted selling to digital shelf tags to kiosks and automation. You're seeing a lot of smaller stores now adding digital ordering kiosks in the store, often to, for convenience stores, often to improve the experience, but also to better manage labor. But within, one type of mobile within the store, digital within the store that I'd like to discuss is just mobile POS. And so when we talk about that, we look at how the way shoppers are checking out evolving. So one potential scenario is that 15% of shoppers check out digital, the store is not involved at all. They purchase the product and they receive the product at home. They never enter the store. In another instance, we're also looking at store pickup. So you may order it online, but you pick it up in the store, the sort of click and collect idea. We're also seeing, and this is what I want to talk a little bit about, more and more mobile point of sale. So I, get on my phone, I log on to the retailer's wireless, and I use my phone or one of the devices in store to scan and bag the products myself, and then I check out. And what this gives the opportunity for retailers and brands alike to do is to create highly targeted promotions and marketing that's directed as you're in the store at the right point. And shoppers are very willing to receive these. And so again, it's just making that more targeted and more personalized experience. But if that happens, given this one scenario, all of a sudden traditional checkout moves to 50%. So that raises questions of what does the front end of the future look like? How will checkout change? What will the merchandising of the future look like for those categories that tend to be heavily impacted by the front end? And so you can see really digital within the store may have as significant of an impact as well as out of the store. And so just bridging between in and out of the store, obviously this isn't the US anymore, but Tesco, I think is a great example of a retailer that's building out digital capabilities, both in and out of the store. So whether it's on their tablet or on their phone, they allow shoppers already to browse for ideas, look through, they can make their list, one click, add items to their list. You can collect your order through click and collect. And then they're actually in pilot phases within the store. And obviously, other retailers have tried this already. But knowing where you are in the store, being able through your loyalty program to check into the store and then know where you are and find the products in the right aisle. They're also in pilots on different prompting within the store from couponing and also scanning shopping. And then launching soon, we'll sort of be completing the entire process from a mobile or digital standpoint. And that will be paying, actually having a mobile wallet, and then also receiving a receipt on your phone or through email as well. So I think Tesco remains one of the better examples of a store-based retailer that's working to fundamentally change their digital capabilities and allow shoppers to engage with them through whatever medium they want to. So stepping quickly to digital out of the store, digital out of the store accounts for about 21% of total chain retail growth in the US. 30% we forecast to come from new stores, and then another 50% from increasing spend or comps in dollars per store. But when you look at digital retail economics, the challenge is consumers are demanding this, but the mix, pricing, COGS, logistics, everything is changing and really impacting the economics in terms of mix. Seasonal can be a little bit harder, or attachment, impulse online. Pricing, obviously, digital increases transparency when you're both in and out of the store. It's creating much more real-time demand-based pricing. And then, from a logistics standpoint, obviously that impacts the economics when all of a sudden your store is responsible for picking, packing, and delivering the product. So overall, digital out of store definitely can change the economics. And so there's a balancing act as retailers and brands, continue to approach the growth of e-commerce. And then finally, thinking from a technology standpoint, seasonal, I think, as we're talking about segmentation and the importance of segmentation, and from a calendar perspective, managing not only the macro, but also the micro and the mini calendars, digital gives you a way to better manage multiple promotions, multiple seasons, multiple calendars at one time in a cost-effective manner. So I think just from a segmentation point of view, this is a good example as well. And then, overall, the logistics models are evolving. This is a much broader discussion, but just to say that, ranging from those that are pure play digital players like Amazon to store-based retailers like Walmart, like Target, like many category specialists, the ways that the logistics are changing are really impacting the digital business models that are growing. And so you're starting to see, moving from national ship to click and collect to full basket delivery to even drive formats. And so I think all we want to say here is that the digital business models will be changing and will impact the overall shopping experience. And as similarly, I think there are new entrants as well. You're starting to see more and more players like Google and many of these digital players that are purely digital, changing the way retailers interact and changing the way consumers interact. These can often make smaller brands look big. And so there's a bigger opportunity there as these digital, or in some instances, not even non-retail players, start to change the role that they play going forward. So when I start to think about the societal, macro, and tech drivers of change, and if you add in political as well, overall, it leads to significant disruption in the industry going forward and a very different scenario. And so when you start to think about in my box, what categories could change, it really changes the way you think about the store going forward. And so again, just going back to Tesco, I think they stated it well as they're talking about moving from the first curve to the second curve, bricks and mortar, bricks and clicks, and how they're changing both within the store to adapt to this new future retail environment. So just a quick industry snapshot to wrap up our discussion today. Where do we see chain retail going? These are some of the big drivers that we look at from an industry perspective. And so when we think about that, 2020, our baseline scenario is 2.9% growth in total retail sales in the US specifically. Chain retail will outpace that growth at 3.6% CAGR from 2014 to 2017. And we expect 599 in billion sales added. But at the same time, another 200 billion coming from digital in chains as well. We'll then break that down, often looking at some of the big channel growth drivers. And you can see here, looking at some of the discount growth, premium grocery, and even some of the big boxes, hyper, super, and mass, that are differentiating their stores right now. You can see that the picture becomes even more mixed when you look at where is the growth coming from. We'll often talk from an industry perspective about consolidation and concentration. And so you can see here that the top 15 retailers in the US, ranked by 2013 sales, represent 48% in 2020 of total US chain retail sales. But when you compare that to the share of sales growth, while from 2009 to 2013, they represented 51% of the growth. Going forward, as some of the smaller players start to take share and grow, you can see that's moving to 49%, about a 200 basis point change going forward. And so what that means is when you start to look at those players ranked by sales added, you see a very different mix. So looking at Amazon, for example, representing 14% of US chain retail sales added from 2014 to 2020. And so you can see there, again, the top 15 from a sales added standpoint, it's just much more mixed between where the growth is coming from. Why is this happening? I've used the word segmentation many times during our discussion today. As markets develop, you move from 5 to 10 segments to 40, 50 plus segments. And you can see here today, the US is already at 40 segments, and you could probably break that down even further. So as markets develop, the complexity increases because retailers need to target more and create a more specific offering within their store. And so as a result of that, retailers often need to own one positioning or another. We'll often talk about two fundamental ways to win, either being a low-cost operator or a differentiated operator. And the operating principles of those two models are very different. Low-cost operators emphasizing simplicity, automation, centralized decisions, really scale-based, low merchandise risk, where on differentiated, it's much more trend-based, time-based, higher human interaction, introduced intentional complexity in the store. And so those retailers that are winning going forward are winning on either end of these spectrums. But as we look forward, these are both being pushed out. And so more retailers are falling into the middle, which is what we often fondly call the valley of death. But when you look at that, it just means that retailers need to be more and more secure in their positioning and really win that positioning going forward. When you look at this from a growth perspective, what we're seeing going forward is, about 41% of the sales growth is coming from those players that are low cost. Differentiated can often be harder because it's more trend-based, it's fast-moving, but those that can win do have an advantage as well from a differentiated standpoint. So you see both of those players are growing faster than those what we'll call the tweeners as well. And so what this means for the store of the future, you can see when you think about Tesco, it's 3 different forms of checkout. It's additional services in the store. It's often a re-merchandise center store. And so it's just a very different store experience going forward. And so then just moving to quickly a few of the breakout segments that are driving these strategic initiatives that we talked about. When we think about what are the big breakout segments that we're watching, it's often digital, it's discounters, it's what we call food progressives, and ethnic, as I mentioned earlier, and then some small boxes like convenience superstores and express. At the same time, you can't deny there are a lot of the share winners that you're seeing through super centers and supermarkets. Overall, as you can see from that chart, when we're looking at a lot of the winners, one commonality is that a lot of them are smaller and are smaller boxes or digital. And so you can see not only in the US and North America, but a trend moving from big to small to digital as these markets develop and as concentration and consolidation increases. So, touching quickly on small boxes, about 39% of North America's sales growth we're forecasting to come from stores under 35,000 square feet. If you were to look at it from a stores basis, 95% of new store growth or net new store growth is coming from stores under 35,000 square feet. And when you start to look at those segments that are opening the most stores, 9 out of 10 of the top store growth segments have average store sizes under 10,000 square feet. So you can start to see this trend through urbanization, through the importance of proximity. The boxes are getting smaller. So just concluding with a few points, I think everyone's sort of thinking about what about the Walmart new small formats? So express stores, I think they've been clear that small formats, both neighborhood market and express, are a potential growth engine for them and something that they're looking at quite a bit. These Walmart Express stores, the newer North Carolina stores are around 12,000 square feet. One important thing, they don't have a convenience premium. So for many small boxes apart from them, it's starting to heighten competition. They're located in areas that have limited access to fresh produce and groceries. They have a broader assortment, so you can do a full infill basket trip there. And they also have many other trip drivers that they've integrated in the store, whether it be through pharmacy or through fuel. Nevertheless, we're expecting to see many more of these going forward. And then just, next to join Target Express opening this summer, this will be more of an urban box compared to many of the more rural Walmart Express stores. The pilot store will be a little bit larger, 20,000 square feet compared to the Walmart Express stores, but will be located near the checkout, near headquarters, and near a university and at the bottom of an apartment complex. So it already has built-in traffic. I think, one distinction will be that this store will still maintain the treasure hunt experience that you'll have in the Target big box store. But as retailers are looking to differentiate, I think this is a good example of one where they're looking to test and learn in this store, which is a key part of differentiation and the time-based strategy. So just to conclude from an industry perspective, what are we expecting to see? More concentration, more segmentation, which will ultimately lead to substitution of store formats, both one store for another store type or one store for digital. We're going to see accelerated saturation as many of these small box formats roll out stores quickly. More branding, localization we've talked a lot about. I think CapEx spending will change as well. From a big box standpoint, fewer new stores, more investment on tech and supply chains as well. The logistics of small box networks are much more challenging. And so what that means for everyone is that, picking a position low cost or differentiated is more important than ever. Being able to maintain and be with the shopper wherever they want to interact, especially as you start to think about the millennials and some of the younger generations, is increasingly important. More multi-format operations, which obviously means more complexity. Localism and data become more and more important. And we see, again, a couple big winners that range from discount to premium, which we'll often also call food progressives, digital, ethnic, rent and used, and then some of the other small box formats like Express and like convenience superstores. So overall, we're expecting a much different retail landscape in 2020. So when you start to think about this discussion today, what we've talked about is what are your planning assumptions? What are the drivers of change? Whether this is your list or, create your own list, but using this framework, what will change for you and what realities do you expect to be different in 2020 that you need to build into your strategic planning now in order to prepare for the future? So this is one framework that we often use to think about it, and one perspective on where we see the future of retail going in North America in 2020. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Keith. If we have time for any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Hannah. Terrific information. And I think the biggest thing that you really think about is 2020 is only 5 years away.
Right.
It seems like a lot is going to happen in a short period of time. When you think 2020 is a long ways away, but in actuality, it's only 5 years. So,
Yeah.
If it's okay, I think we do have some time for some questions that have come through. And I would remind anybody that's still on with us in the presentation, if you do have questions, please enter it in your chat session right below your screen. The first question that I see here is, during the societal discussion that you had, you referred to multiple generations in one store.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment further on the importance of intergenerational distinctions to retailers?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So I think, when we look at this, you're obviously now going to have five generations in one store, and the consumer preferences within these are very different, and the store requirements are different. And so for retailers, this means more complexity from a store experience standpoint, balancing the importance of digital and digital engagement within the store, but also, the shopping experience that the millennials may want may be different from the boomers. The services required may be different. And so as you start to think about all of the strategic choices that need to be made, it creates a very different landscape and a lot of complexity to think about. And it's actually, we're going to be having this discussion next month with GMDC in one of the next webinars on these intergenerational distinctions. So I think it's something that everyone is really starting to think about now. As boomers age out of peak retail spend years, what does this mean, and how do you cater to multiple generations in one store? So I think overall, just from a strategic choices standpoint, it's something that we need to think about.
Yeah, terrific. And that's the first thing I just was thinking about is the question came up about generations and how it's impacting retailers and stores. And you're right, Retailnet Group I know is going to do a session in May. I think it's the third week of May on generational distinctions. So we'll be interested to hear more about that in the future. Another question that came through, you also mentioned discounters as a breakout segment. Could you comment further on how you view the future of discounters, and at what point do you think they reach saturation?
Sure. We actually just completed some new discounter research. We believe, and this estimate could tweak, but we believe there could be room for about 15,000 more discounter stores. Now, that will be dependent on a few things. I think it could be impacted by the growth of small formats like Walmart Express, because I think those would take some of those shoppers. I think it will be impacted, if there were significant changes in the macroeconomic landscape, or I think consolidation could also impact that as well. But we're still pretty positive on discounters from a total segment standpoint. When you think about the macroeconomic drivers and the consumer liquidity picture, these discounters are becoming more sophisticated. They're working on different trip drivers, adding more consumables, and really changing the categories and the way they merchandise in the stores. So we're still very positive on discounters. I think you still will see another 6-7 years of build out. And even after that, I think you'll still see build out. It just may be that the store level productivity may start to decline as there's more saturation. But overall, as a channel, we expect, ranging from sort of single price point operators to limited assortment grocery to limited assortment mass. We're pretty confident in the discounters as a whole.
Okay. I know one question probably a lot of our members at GMDC will ask is, what do you think will be the biggest impact on general merchandise and health and beauty categories in the next few years?
So I think there's a few things. When I look at the channels that I'm thinking about, I think, discounters will obviously be impacted. I think there's an opportunity there because of the changes in the way they're merchandising differently. So I think from a discount standpoint, I think it impacts not only the branding, but the pack sizes and the requirements of selling through these stores, I think will continue to be more sophisticated as they're heightening their capabilities. But I think from a general merchandise and beauty categories, there's a lot of opportunity in the discounters, especially if they're capturing more of the infill full basket trips. I think there's an opportunity there to gain new shoppers through those segments. I think when we look at drug, for example, and particularly with beauty, I think we see more and more sophistication with beauty as players like Walgreens look to really own well across every category of the store. And so you're seeing much more sophisticated beauty consultants. The services in the store are heightening, the fixturing, everything in the store is becoming an elevated experience, more information based. I think that will continue to play a role. And then also from a beauty standpoint, I think more personalization I expect. I think just the heightened level of services and what shoppers require and also expect will increase. And I think the drug players as a whole are really looking to be ahead of this change as they look to compete with, I'd say, increasing beauty specialists like Ulta or Sephora. So we're pretty positive on that category going forward, but I'd expect more personalization and also potentially more channel blurring as more retailers look to play in those categories.
Right. Okay. Here's a question that just came through. You mentioned convenience superstores as a breakout segment. Could you clarify how these boxes are distinct from traditional convenience stores and what strategies they are going to employ to win in the future?
Sure. So when we're talking about convenience superstores, we're looking at players like Wawa, like Sheetz, like Casey's General Stores, just to name a few. And I think what's different about these three stores or this type of store is that they're almost three stores in one. They often will have their own QSR sort of food service outlet, but as well, they're really redefining the traditional convenience assortment, and they're merchandising it differently. They're often elevating the store experience, and they're doing a good job of merchandising often to millennials. You see the marketing and the promotions in store. They're doing a much better job of call outs there. So I think we're pretty positive on this channel because they can bring in the shoppers from a sort of food service, beverage category as traffic drivers, but they're also elevating and improving their traditional convenience store assortment as well. Now, it is a little bit more refined from a space standpoint or assortment standpoint, but it's much more targeted and I'd say better merchandised as well. And the store experience is better. And what I think is unique about these is that I would call them sort of shopper personas, but the shoppers that are going into these stores are different than the traditional convenience store, often target shopper. So they're expanding their shopper base, and I think overall that's an opportunity for the brands that sell through these stores, as well as the retailers that operate them.
Okay. Another question just popped up. You commented about the impact in the discounters and drug classes of trade with respect to HBC and general merchandise.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the impact in the food class of trade on these categories?
Specifically within grocery, like within grocery stores, what will be the impact?
Yes, I think that's what they're asking.
Okay. So I think when I think about grocery in these categories, I think again, many of the grocery stores or big box stores will be looking to differentiate. And so they're differentiating through a few different things, but they're really, as I was talking about that positioning, they're going to either go towards low cost or differentiated. So based on the retailer that you're selling through, regardless of category, understanding the positioning within these stores will be more important. So for the low cost players, it's going to be all about simplicity. So refining your assortment, making sure that you improve productivity in the stores. I think space allocation may change a little bit, and they're always going to be looking for labor savings and cost savings. So if you're operating or selling through one of those stores, those players, it's just really going to be about getting cost out of the business. On the other side, differentiated players, those categories, I see that more about improving the experience, improving the seasonal, improving impulse, and gifting as well. I think is something that we're looking at a little bit with in many of these players as they're looking to differentiate. Gifting is just one example of something that can cross many of the intergenerational distinctions. And so, as a growth platform, it makes a lot of sense because you may be gifting from one generation to the next, and it supports that growth. Within these, I'd say the only other thing that I think is changing for many of the grocery stores that we're looking at, or some of the big box players, you are starting to see changes to the center store because of players are increasing. I'd say I don't know how to use the word encroachment, but with the involvement of more food service or grocerants in the store, and the involvement of more produce fresh, and more to go foods, you are seeing some players move the traditional center store where a lot of the, I'd say, general merch and HBA categories are pushed or moved to a different place within the store. And you're starting to see some of the store experience change. So space allocation may change, location in the store could change. But I think the expectation when we've looked really across these players is just as they're looking to compete and differentiate in a more competitive environment, the importance of collaboration, and collaboration on data, and not just within your specific brand or your specific category, but collaboration of the whole and how the retailer can change and improve going forward. I think that becomes more and more important. So again, I think it's regardless of category, but I think collaboration will change going forward.
Okay, well, terrific. I think that's about all the time we have today, Hannah. I want to really thank you for your presentation today. I want to thank Retailnet Group for the support overall with this presentation and the ones coming up in the future.
Thank you.
So as a reminder to everybody, this session, along with all the previous Videocast sessions, can be viewed in the archive section tab at www.gmbcconnect.org. And the schedule of all the future events, including the Generational Distinctions session that we'll have up in May. I think that's the name of it. You can go to the same section and look at the future Videocast events that will be coming up. So Hannah, again, thank you. And thank everybody for your time today and participation. Have a great day.